Okay, well, we'll get started. Well, thanks everybody for joining our webinar today, which is focused on the subject of regulatory shaming and how it might be utilized in the context of addressing climate change. My name is David Konisky, and I'm a professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University in Bloomington, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. Let me first thank APPAM for hosting today's event. As many of you know, APPAM hosts these occasional webinars on policy topics, research methods, and professional development. You can read more about the webinars and see upcoming events on the APPAM website. As I mentioned, the topic of today's webinar is climate shaming, which is a public policy approach that attempts to change corporate behavior through the use of information that shines a light on the harmful impacts of corporate actions on climate change. One might think of climate shaming as either an alternative or complementary policy instrument to other approaches such as emissions regulation or carbon pricing. Among the key questions for the session today is, how might climate shaming work? What is the theory of change that underlies it? Are there good examples of its effectiveness? And what might be some limitations of its use? One of our panel participants, Dr. Sharon Yadin, has recently written a book on climate shaming, and the structure of today's webinar will be for Dr. Yadin to present some of her main arguments from her work, followed by commentary from three scholars who have extensive expertise in areas of law, business, and the environment, and the use of non-regulatory approaches in public policy. Let me now briefly introduce our distinguished panelists in the order in which they will speak today. Sharon Yadin is a senior lecturer of law and regulation at the Yezreel Valley College School of Public Administration and Public Policy, and a research fellow at the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions at the University of Haifa. Dr. Yadin's research focuses on government agencies' soft regulatory approaches, regulatory transparency, and corporate disinformation and obstruction in regulatory contexts. We are also joined by Assem Prakash, who is professor of political science and the Walker Family Professor for the Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington. Dr. Prakash is a member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Board on Environmental Change in Society, and an international research fellow at the Center for Corporate Reputation at the University of Oxford. Dr. Prakash has published widely on environmental policy, climate governance, NGOs and nonprofits, and voluntary and private regulation. We are also joined by Sarah Dadush, who is professor of law at Rutgers University. Dr. Dadush is founding director of Rutgers Law School's Business and Human Rights Law Program and the Responsible Contracting Project, which has a mission to improve human rights in global supply chains through innovative contracting practices. Dr. Dadush's research focuses on business and human rights, and her work explores various legal mechanisms for improving the social and environmental performance of multinational corporations. And finally, we're joined by Joana Setzer, who is an associate professorial research fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. At the Grantham Research Institute, she leads the Climate Change Laws of the World project. Dr. Setzer's work focuses on climate litigation, subnational diplomacy, multi-level climate and environmental governance, and climate change legislation. Before I turn the virtual floor to Dr. Yadin, let me first note a few things on logistics. Following the formal remarks of our panelists, we'll have ample time for discussion and questions. Please use the chat feature in Zoom to ask your questions, and we'll also give you an opportunity to pose your questions directly to our panelists. Again, I would also encourage everyone to take a minute to type in your name and institution so we all know who is here today into the chat window. And with that, I will turn things over to Sharon. Welcome.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here today. Let me just share my slides. Hope you can see them now. I just wanted to start off by saying that this book is part of a series of Cambridge elements on organizational response to climate change. And the editors of the book were Assem Prakash and David Konisky, who are here with us today. So a big thank you to your wonderful editorial assistants. And I'll start off by saying that
Sharon, we lost your audio. I don't know if you...
Sharon, we can't hear you.
Maybe she should exit and re-enter, rejoin.
Sharon, we can't hear you.
Now it looks like you're muted, but maybe it was the microphone that was out of battery. The headphone. Ah, yes, now we hear you.
Now we hear you.
Okay, I
back.
switched. Sorry, I switched it to another microphone. So the main argument is that regulatory climate change should and could become a viable tool in the fight against climate change. And the methodology is mostly conceptual, theoretical. I offer a descriptive theory as well as a normative theory and a policy-oriented analysis. This book offers also a comparative and multidisciplinary analysis. I study examples of regulatory climate change from EU member states, the US, the UK, and Israel. And I utilize regulatory shaming theory, climate change law, regulation, and governance literature, and environmental disclosure scholarship. So these are the basic tools that I'm working with in the book. And the questions explored include: what role can shaming play in the current regulatory landscape to address the climate crisis? Can shaming be justified as a legitimate climate regulation tool? And what are the concerns and opportunities for regulatory climate shaming? And how can policymakers address them? So these were the questions that were the focus of my research. The questions were: how does the conceptual framework of regulatory climate shaming, how does it support, how does it relate to approaches like eco-shaming, which are more established, and regulatory shaming in the health sector? Can we study from other sectors to the context, for the context of climate change? And what are the characteristics of regulatory climate shaming schemes in various jurisdictions? So in order to understand the regulatory climate change framework, we need a basic definition. So what do I mean when I use the regulatory climate change framework? This is about conveying information or messages to the public by government regulators regarding corporate actions that have a harmful impact on climate change. And it is used in order to deter companies from continuing business as usual. So it's a regulation style that is based on public opinion. It is not your usual regulatory tool. It's not based on legal coercion, but on supplying information and communication. It's not about legal sanctioning, but about utilizing soft law and soft regulation tools, using not only or not mainly companies' legal license, but their social license. So the legitimacy that they can have from various stakeholders and the public at large. And the main goal of regulatory climate shaming is to induce companies to comply with climate change norms, which are set in rules, laws, etc., but also to go beyond compliance and do something more for the environment, for the climate, that is not currently legislated or considered binding. what's interesting that is that regulatory shaming uses companies' reputational sensitivity among stakeholders. And the idea is that hopefully companies will adjust their actions to avoid financial loss. So this is not really about shame as an emotion, This is not really about people's feeling, because these are artificial legal entities, the corporations, and the idea is that is to cause them a fear of reputational and therefore financial loss. The mechanism is that we want to nudge stakeholders to respond to the negative information. For example, consumers can boycott a company or demonstrate against it. Shareholders, investors, and donors can withhold their donations and investments. Employees can put pressure on their employers to change their ways to become more climate friendly. Litigants can use the information publicized to pursue legal action. And the public at large, the media, NGOs, environmental activists, these are all stakeholders that can participate in the shaming process and help pressure firms to become more climate friendly. Regulators and legislators can also respond to this information, as well as suppliers, creditors, competitors, and other businesses. The main idea is premised on the growing public concern regarding climate change and on the public's willingness to act. For example, a recent Yale survey showed that most respondents are willing to engage in consumer activism by punishing companies that contribute to climate change, but they don't know which companies to punish. So this tool can respond exactly to this informational gap. And indeed, this tool is based on the informational gaps that characterize the problem of corporate contributions to climate change, as well as the potential ability of regulators to capture the public's attention with new and important information in this regard, especially concerning climate obstruction, which is not common knowledge for many people. And we can use regulatory climate shaming in various schemes, including rating, ranking, scoring, and blacklisting, publication of enforcement actions, climate labels, emission databases, and even disclosure obligations of in-company reporting. So if maybe we'll have more time and we can get to discussing these examples in further detail. And I'll conclude with the theory, the main theory that the book offers, which is that regulatory climate shaming can not only reduce emissions, but also fight climate obstruction, which is any illegitimate or fraudulent corporate activity aimed at thwarting climate policy. And this is done hopefully by setting corporate reputational gains that are related to climate denial and climate washing, carried out by misleading climate statements, labels, and reports, which firms often use to be seen as more green and more responsible. So when firms try to use public opinion and communicational arenas to influence the public and policymakers, regulatory climate shaming is a proportional, very symmetric tool that can respond to that in these same arenas. Regulatory climate shaming harnesses credible information sharing by the government to combat corporate disinformation and deception. So it's an adequate response. We can also publicly assign blame and liability to industries that often deny such blame or shift it elsewhere. for examples, to consumers. So regulatory shaming can expose these corporate manipulations and offset these reputational gains that companies wish to gain. And obstructionism aims to silence criticism, keeping business as usual, meaning no change in climate policies. While regulatory shaming, on the other hand, exposes companies' obstructionism, encourages public response, and calls for a change in status quo. So I believe that regulatory climate shaming can fight climate change, can specifically fight climate obstruction, and has the potential to become a highly suitable means for addressing climate denial, also a big problem and that we have in this context, because both shaming and denial are communication-based strategies that address corporate reputations and aim to influence public opinion. So I'll stop here, and hopefully this is enough to give you something to think about, and I invite any comments and further questions later on.
Great. Thank you, Sharon. Assem, I'll turn the floor to you.
Thank you. So let me start by congratulating Sharon on her excellent book. David Konisky and I are delighted that you've published with Cambridge University 11th series in organizational response to climate change. And, we are delighted the reception the book is receiving from different stakeholders. So let me just summarize what I think is this theory of change, and then identify 3 questions that we could discuss. So the premise is that reputations matter for firms, which is prima facie a reasonable assumption, because at least in the United States, more than 50% of market capitalization of firms of S&P 500 is in non-tangible assets, of which reputations are a very important factor. So reputations matter, and reputations can be shaped by information inputs. So this is the important premise that's underlying the theory of regulatory shaming. However, there's an additional set of assumptions, and this is what I call the information deficit models. That a lot of stakeholders cannot form a correct assessment of firms because of information asymmetries and information deficits. So that means there is a demand for information by these different stakeholders so that they can form an assessment of the firms, but they don't have adequate access to it. So in the theory of regulatory shaming, it's the supply-based interventions by the government that supplies the information that allows stakeholders to develop a well-informed opinion about the firms and therefore alter their reputational perceptions of these firms. Of course, this assumes that these stakeholders get the information in the right format, they're able to process this, so they have the computational and cognitive abilities, and they are willing to act on it. Because even at a stakeholder level, there's a collective action issue. Stakeholders may seek to free ride. So you could be, running a hedge fund, and you get this negative information about oil and gas industry, and you are very angry with them, but oil and gas stocks are doing very well. So do you dump those all alone and have a success payoff, or you need to coordinate with other hedge funds to dump X, Y, or Z industry? So I think it's an important issue to understand collective action issues at the stakeholder level as well. So once stakeholders act, the firms get the message, they are able to correctly identify it, and they are willing and able to act on it. So there is a level of what we call behavioral plasticity, that they are understanding that, yeah, our reputation is getting managed, and this is how we can fix it so that we minimize the damage or enhance the gains. So this theory raises at least 3 set of questions. First, of course, is, do firms really care about all information signals from all stakeholders? Or are some stakeholders more important than others? And what do we think about the theory of firm when it comes to regulatory shaming? How do firms prioritize? And even if they get these signals, do they think it's a short-term obstruction? Or do they think it's a long-term damage and they can't ride out of the storm? That's one. So it's really, trying to understand the scope conditions of regulatory shaming. When does it work? When does it not? And why? The second set of questions about spillover effects. So the repetition could be firm specific and repetition could be collective at the industry level. So is regulatory shaming of firm X spill over to firm Y? And it can happen both ways. It can make firm Y look worse because one could say this industry is terrible for climate change. X belongs to this industry, so X is terrible. But Y is also part of this industry, so Y is also terrible. So there is a repetition spillover. But one could also make an argument, it may actually look Y to look much better than what it is. Because if the stakeholders are targeting only firm X, then firm Y by omission looks better because it doesn't have the negative spotlight. So again, this is an empirical question. To what extent regulatory shaming leads to industry-wide negative or positive spillovers? And what can firms do ex ante, proactively, to kind of either guard against it or to kind of ride on it and take benefit from it? So let me stop here.
Thank you, Assem. I'll turn the floor over to Sarah.
Thank you, David, and very nice to be here. A real pleasure to hear you present, Sharon, and offer some reactions and thoughts. I think what really kind of, as you were explaining, sort of gelled the idea of regulatory shaming for me was when you mentioned the question of how is it different from eco-shaming? And what I gleaned is that the difference is that the information that is being provided to the public is being provided by government, is being required by government, and then subsequently provided by the government to the public. And I think that really is a critical piece of what makes this tool so promising and useful, as you say. And I would just add that I think we can make this argument for climate change, but we can also make it for upholding and promoting higher human rights standards across supply chains. So as far as opportunities that I see coming out of this tool and this approach, it is, what has been spoken about already to some extent, which is that, consumers and not infrequently also investors lack information to make decisions about what to consume, what companies to patronize or invest in and not. So having access to this information can bridge, as you said, that informational gap and elevate a certain sense of awareness of what are best practices, because how these informational requirements are being composed by the government regulators teaches us, the public, about what is a good way to think about environmental or social performance, right? Like these are the metrics, these are the aspects, the features of human rights and environmental performance to pay attention to. This allows the public to elevate and expand our own understanding and awareness of the issues, which is a kind of information that is powerful in and of itself. And I think as well, sort of placing that information in the hands of consumers is a way also to activate consumer sense of responsibility, right? To educate us on how can I be a responsible consumer or a consumer who consumes in line with my own values. So I really see the benefits of regulatory shaming in that lens, through that lens. And then as far as the limitations, and some of these really pick up on what Assem raised, is that it kind of all rides on the quality of the information, right? So if the information is not of a high quality or is not actually educating us or raising our awareness in a practicable way, then that really limits what we can do with it, and it limits the utility of the regulatory shaming approach in general. And so the quality of the information and the content of the information, and as Assem said, the sort of accessibility, the formatting of the information, is it presented to us in such a way that we can actually use? And the other limitation is that when you are relying on public opinion to do the regulatory work, and this is perhaps the most serious limitation, you are putting a certain amount of faith in the hands of consumers and investors that I'm not sure is warranted, because as much as I really believe in consumer protection, we have also, I'm sure, all seen that consumers often say one thing but then do another, right? Because their purchasing is driven by considerations beyond, how they would like the world to be. They have other restrictions, pocketbook restrictions, and other conflicting, consumers have conflicting values operating at all times around quality, price, not just, in quotes, just the environmental or human rights history or future of the products that they are purchasing. So consumers are, complicated entities through which to improve environmental and human rights outcomes. And they're also fickle, right? We have a little bit of ADD when it comes to, oh, is this the company, in a way, as Assem was saying, like, this is the company that I should be worried about, and then I don't pay attention to the others, and then I forget about it. So there is that aspect. And the other aspect, with respect to investors in particular, is that, and shareholders, that they are so far from being homogeneous. And we have seen in the last couple of years, I'm sure that this is addressed in your own research, the rise of the anti-ESG movement, right? The anti-ESG backlash that betrays very transparently vastly differing views about the role of the corporation and whether its purpose should include consideration of environmental and social interests. So these are all, for these reasons, both the pluses and the minuses, as I see them, of regulatory shaming as a device. I would say that, on its own, it isn't sufficient, right? And I know you acknowledge that, but I just really want to reinforce it, that you need to bolster it with actual legislation and regulation that forces companies not just to disclose, but actually to change their practices, and to be to uphold in an enforceable way high environmental and human rights standards. And I'm very happy to speak more when on the other side of other people's presentations about, some new regulatory models that I think combine really beautifully with regulatory shaming. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Joana.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. And again, I also want to congratulate Sharon for writing the book, publishing the book, and it's a really important book. I was very glad to read already parts of it and to have collaborated with Sharon in a project around climate obstruction, which is how we met. Also very happy to be part of this panel. Anyway, let me bring my comments, my approach to Sharon's work, which, as David said, comes from the legal perspective. So the way I was reading her work and listening to this presentation is that the area that I mostly do my research on, which is climate change litigation and climate shaming or regulatory shaming, are different approaches that can be used in a combined way or like reinforcing ways to address and combat climate change. So they can intersect and influence each other. They're different, but sometimes they might intersect. So what I wanted to do in these few minutes is to explore some of this relationship and maybe think about how, like, the why, the how, and the what of each one of these strategies and some of their challenges. So just in case colleagues are not so familiar, the idea of climate change litigation is one that consists of using the legal system to hold governments and corporations or other entities into account for their contributions to climate change. There are many definitions, but let's keep that one. So you're using the law to hold those actors that most contributed, that most can do something about the problem, accountable. And it also seeks to enforce existing legislation. So if you think about the regulation that we're talking about here, it could also be a form to enforce that regulation. And then in the climate shaming, I think, of course, Sharon's work is about the regulatory side. And I very much agree with the point that Sarah made, that it's a critical part of this approach, that it is coming from, it's required by governments. But of course, there's also the other side of the shaming, which is the one done by NGOs and civil society, which I think also we can think as part of this big picture. So I said I wanted to look at the why, how, and what. So let's begin with the why. So why are we using climate litigation? Why are we using regulatory shaming? And there's something about the raising awareness that has been already discussed. All of these tools, they have been added to the toolbox as ways to bring attention from the media, from the actors involved, so from the governments, from the corporations, to the importance of what needs to be done, to the science. And so, for example, if we think about the lawsuits against major oil companies, some are trying to get these companies to pay compensation for damages. Some are trying to get these companies to stop expanding, or to some of these lawsuits are brought against finance institutions for them to stop financing activities that result in emissions. So we see this not only what they're trying to get ultimately, but in the process, we see that aim of raising awareness. And with the shaming, I guess both the regulatory shaming and the one by campaigning, that these also can raise the draw attention to the issues that later will become subject of litigation. So you can see the litigation enforcing regulation, but also these campaigns or the regulation becoming later a litigation. Now, from this common issue around the raising awareness, I think I really see these the how. So the second point, the how, as complementary strategies. So I think really it's important to understand how they complement each other, and I think rarely this has been done. If you think about some of the legal victories in climate litigation, they can be bolstered by regulatory climate efforts. So if a court, for instance, rules against a company for violating regulations, then you have the regulation then deterring other companies from similar behavior. And when we look at what's happened in climate litigation, it's interesting to see that the climate washing cases that Sharon mentioned, so the climate washing efforts have been the most successful strategy. So it's one that only started recently, and that has grown a lot. So now we published this report recently, and in 2023 we know of 47 cases of climate washing, and a total of 140 climate washing cases mostly against corporations. And different from the other types of litigation, these have met really significant success. We have more than 70% of success in cases decided banning advertisement or in general in favor of the claimants. So climate washing has been among the many litigation strategies the most successful. And I think it goes really to this point of the reputation, the shaming that we also see in some of these efforts, to the general shaming efforts. So now the third point is the what, and I think that I agree with what Sharon and Sarah and Assem were saying in terms of the influencing aspect. So how is, for instance, the litigation influencing corporate and in the litigation case also government behavior? Well, it has been, and there's research on that, not only trying to force companies and governments to change their behavior, but it has achieved that in many of the cases, being the decisions, the ruling binding decisions against governments or against corporations. So the climate washing examples are more straightforward. You have an advertisement campaign that is clearly misleading, you have to put that down. But in the cases against governments, it's about regulation and increasing regulation. And that regulation could also be regulation to regulate advertisement and avoid greenwashing. So you have full cycles there. And we did a study in terms of this reputational damage that looked at the impact of litigation on share prices of companies. And my economist colleagues identified a drop in share prices resulting from the filing and decisions against companies. So you see the litigation itself, not only the decision, but just the filing and having that the coverage around can result in this drop of share prices. And yeah, I think we could maybe even try to do a similar study with this type of regulation to see what are the impacts of this regulation. That would be an interesting research question or project to pursue. So back to the litigation, not only these cases, you see them as individual cases, but you see these precedents, they add to each other and they provide a framework for future cases. So there's a lot of learning and inspiration coming from cases. And the more you see the regulation, the more also often that allows for further clarification through the litigation. Or when the legislation, that regulation doesn't exist, the litigation can prompt for more regulation, which could be a good thing. So now just to finish, I think also it's important to take into consideration that these mechanisms, these approaches have limitations. So thinking about the litigation, the climate litigation, while it can result in some concrete results, legal outcomes, the ruling is of course limited to that case often, and that can be a very lengthy process, and it can be very risky and very expensive. I think similarly, if we think about the shaming, it's a very lengthy process to have the regulation, to require the information, to then make that available. And sometimes I think it can be frustrating and insufficient that we're doing all these, putting out all these solutions there that are so slow for a problem that requires so much urgency. And then just to finish, of course, there's something important about the shaming, and we want at the same time to make sure that the shaming is shaming the right target. So I often have, when I'm speaking to especially the corporate, this discussion that they say, well, but we're trying our best, we're putting out targets, we're trying to be ambitious, we were not even required, we went beyond what the law required, and now we're being punished by these lawsuits, by shaming from society, and this makes us stop to want to try. And I think there's a bit of exaggerating there, and sometimes this is not always fair, but there is something also to take into consideration, that who you're shaming with the litigation, with the regulation, and that the biggest shame should be against those who are not doing anything, not maybe so much against those that are trying, or that some balance needs to be struck there. So just to conclude, I think that both climate litigation and shaming are interconnected tools, and they have been really fascinating tools to fight this big problem. And therefore, this book, this type of research, is really important for us to understand what formal legal pathways exist for increased accountability and change. And yeah, I'm happy also to answer the questions, although I already should mention that I'll have to sadly leave soon because I have another clashing commitment. So if there are any specific questions for me, these can be sent by email, or to maybe the chair, and then sent to me. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Joana. So I'll first ask all the panelists to turn your cameras back on. I'm going to invite Sharon to respond to any of the comments she heard from colleagues here. As Sharon is doing that, please feel free to put your questions into the chat. I've already seen a couple come through. That's great. I'll also invite you to raise your hand and ask the question yourself. So we'll come to audience questions here in a moment. But first, I'll turn to Sharon in case you want to respond to any of the remarks from your colleagues.
Sure. Thanks, David. And thanks, everyone, for these great, excellent comments. Just a few thoughts. So Sarah talked about the quality of the information. Yes, I completely agree. There's a danger in regulatory shaming in general, even that regulators will use inaccurate information, unsubstantiated information, or publish information that prematurely. And that could harm people's trust in government publication, and regulatory shaming is based on creating that trust. Otherwise, stakeholders will not respond as we expect them to. So it's important that the information will go through some procedures that are set in laws, regulations, or in other legal instruments, because currently regulatory shaming in general and regulatory climate shaming do not have a formal legal framework, usually at least, that, for example, guarantee companies' right to be heard prior to these publications, and maybe amend what needs to be amended beforehand. What are the rules for privacy or for deleting the information after a certain period of time? And it's important that regulators will also update the information frequently, so to ensure that it is accurate. And in the context of climate change, these standards do change rapidly. It's a dynamic field, and it will also help to establish credibility for the regulators and the information that they publicize. On the other hand, regulators need to acknowledge, Sarah mentioned the anti-ESG movement, that there is another danger, and that is that the finger will point in the other directions. Regulators are trying to shame companies. Some companies are trying to shame them back. So in terms of the reputations of regulators themselves, they need to consider this as part of their process, and really make sure that, as Sarah and Joana pointed out, there are no risks that are maybe too big in terms of litigation against regulators, and that the regulatory shaming does indeed target the right corporations in the right context with the appropriate information. Another point that I'd like to consider is Sarah talked about how regulatory shaming needs to be part of a whole suite of laws and regulations in the climate context. I completely agree that regulatory shaming is not meant to be a standalone tool. But we need to consider that many countries still don't have climate laws enacted, and other types of regulations and procedures are not effectively executed. And so a lot of the times we see shaming being used as a tool that complements something that there's a void. There's a void in climate law and governance in national levels, of course, in the international level. And Joana spoke about litigation, and sometimes it's successful. A lot of the time, it's still not giving us the results that we're hoping to see. So regulatory shaming can help maybe experiment with soft law and regulation approaches that can maybe prove effective. So I'll stop there, and thanks again. I understand there are some questions in the chat.
Yes, maybe we'll come to those here in a minute, but I want to first give Sarah, Assem a chance to reflect any further, if you'd like, on any of the comments back from Sharon or others. No obligation, just inviting if you have.
Yeah, so I think this is Sarah's comment on ESG, pro ESG and anti-ESG. So how does the theory of regulatory shaming work when stakeholders have heterogeneous preferences? Or what I mean by that is, is the theory of change when preferences of stakeholders converge different from when preferences of stakeholders are so polarized? So does regulatory shaming work in non-polarized issues? And it doesn't work in polarized issues because stakeholders are giving mixed signals to the firm, do this or not do this. So I'd like to hear from Sarah and from Sharon, and actually David as well. He's written a lot of this. On what do you think?
David, you were named. I mean, well, one thing, it's taking us a little bit off the ESG, but I think it's a real challenge in general that to be regulating when against a backdrop of such differently minded supposed like beneficiaries of regulation. And that, I mean, to my mind, brings in a role for more substantive regulation, actually, more government enforced regulation, because somebody has to take it a little bit out of the hands of individuals / subjective values. And in particular, to create at least a level like legal playing field, because otherwise, how do we make this work? And this connects to a point that I wanted to make in relation to the last thing that Sharon said, which is that I see the regulatory shaming as being like, if we see a spectrum of regulation, it's like on the far left end, you would have the sort of purely voluntary, purely reputational mechanisms where it's just consumers getting the word out, for example, on social media or what have you, the old school, all corporate social responsibility reports, it's up to you. Do you have one? Do you not? Like, it's purely voluntary. And the regulatory aspect is also totally voluntary. This comes as a in between, I think, where it's the disclosure requirement is a binding legal requirement, but what you're disclosing is largely about what you're doing. The regulation isn't actually making you change anything in how you're doing things. And then on the farther right end of the spectrum, you would have the type of regulation that actually is making the company change the way that it does business. And there's a real question about when is the right time for that kind of regulation that I want to pose to everybody, building off of what Assem raised around, when we have these massively polarized constituencies, when do we know when is the right time to pull the hard regulatory levers?
Yeah, I might just add, I think is why I think about regulatory shaming, climate shaming. It kind of actually sits in the middle a little bit, right? It's in the middle of you have disclosure on one side, which might mandate that companies reveal something about their performance, right? So we think about this in terms of financial performance, or might be their environmental performance, right? But the idea there is just by go back to Assem's discussion about information asymmetries, the role government is playing there is to require information be disclosed, or then to reveal that to the public, but kind of in an objective way, without making kind of normative claims about what's good or bad, right? The other side you're describing, I think, is sort of as more standard regulation, right? Where we are making decisions about what behavior we're trying to incentivize, right? By mandating certain rules and prescriptions, things of that nature. For me, regulatory shaming is somewhere in the middle, at least as I understand Sharon's argument, which that government is doing more than requiring disclosure. It's taking that information and making a normative set of claims or assertions about what is good or bad behavior, right? So if you're a company with really high emissions, not only have you disclosed that, but we're going to tell you where you rank relative to others, let's say in your sector of the economy, right? Or other similar sized firms. And to me, that's a really interesting and potentially fraught role for government to play, right? Considering concerns about backlash and the fact that government has to interact with these firms in a lot of different venues. It could potentially be really effective, it seems to me, if done well. But I also imagine many governments across the world, and obviously it's going to vary by context, being really reticent to sort of take on this kind of an approach, because worrying about what kind of risk that puts them at, what the reputational effects for them will be, as Sharon noted. So it's really interesting. And I think, we can talk about maybe some particular cases. And Sharon, I think you talk about some of those cases in your book where we see government taking this additional role, right? Not just disclosure, but also doing some of that evaluative kind of work as well. Which is something that we often have left to sort of the nonprofit world to sort of take on, right? But here, government would have a much more assertive role. I think it's quite provocative.
So I have a follow-up question for David. So David, I like your typology that you're talking about pure information disclosures, scorecards at one hand, and a tight-fisted regulatory approach on the other, and regulatory shaming in the middle. So if SEC initiates a proceeding against a firm or FTA or any regulatory agency, and they take out a press release. Is that regulatory shaming, or that's simply regulators doing their job? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's sort of advertising, an action that they're taking, right? So maybe it's a little bit of a hybrid, it's a little bit of both, right? And I'm sure, and that's where I'm sure, as part of those efforts, they're trying to shape preferences, shape response from stakeholders and such, right? I don't know that would typically fall under the umbrella of regulatory shaming, as Sharon kind of describes it in her book. I'd be curious what she thinks, because it's more of an artifact of some other activity as opposed to the principal objective or the principal effort.
I think when regulators publicize the fact that they have initiated some sort of legal procedure, maybe issued fines or administrative payments, and then they publicize that fact, or that a company has lost in court in litigation with regulators. That's something that regulators also do. That can be considered, in my view, regulatory shaming. Of course, it's a matter of definition, especially when the regulators attach condemnation to that publication. So we often see with regulators in various fields, by the way, that they also mention that the company was wrong in its action, and that it endangered the public safety or the environment, and that regulator sees it as something it sees it harshly, something very wrong to be avoided. So it amplifies the legal sanction with some sort of another maybe layer of sanction or enforcement tool that we can conceptualize, in my opinion, as shaming.
Great. Let's turn to the audience. I noticed a few questions in the chat, and Gogwal, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. I apologize if I didn't. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask one of your three questions?
Thank you, David. You almost got it. It's Gogol, so pretty close. We'll take it.
Okay, sorry.
I think something that's close to what I am interested in terms of my research is the difference between federal lawmaking and local lawmaking. So I would go with question 3. So is there room for local/state level regulators and policymakers to influence anti-environment organizations? So by anti-environment organization, I mean like those who are perpetrators when it comes to climate change, through shaming or any other mechanism that you can would like to tell us, especially for me, because I'm trying to learn more about on these other things. Again, this question is for everyone.
Google, can you give me an example?
For example, let's say a state like Texas might be more against, let's say, organizations like Planned Parenthood, and they might take steps against those, whereas they might be pro-oil, so they might be legislations might be pro-Exxon. So is there a way to find a ways? Is there a way to address that, but in a context where these organizations, let's say, forcing or asking or ensuring that regulators in a state like Texas can take steps against Exxon or companies like those? So basically pitting the political class against the let's say, the bureaucracy in a way.
So David, may I respond?
Please.
Yeah, so I think, Google, that's a lovely intervention. So you're extending the theory of regulatory shaming to the nonprofit sector. And the premise is that nonprofit sector also cares deeply about its reputation, and any action that kind of undermines that reputation would make nonprofits sensitive to their actions. So I think there are two ways to think about it. One is that in the state of Texas, you're an environmental organization, you know the ecosystem you're operating in. if the state comes down heavily against you, does that hurt you or help you? So one school of thought would say that it actually helps you because you become an environmental hero and you become the focal point for national level mobilization, and the money will start flowing in because you're the right person who's fighting this, terrible big organization that is trying to shut you down. So it's very interesting that the shaming can backfire and it can actually enhance the legitimacy of the shamed actor. So that's why context matters, and that's why the scope conditions really matter. That does shaming work as intended, or it actually can backfire and help the shamed actor?
That's actually like perfect what I was thinking in my head. So that works perfectly. Like, okay, so I was like trying to see, because the thought process was the same. So if we act against an organization, let's say now we are ignoring Texas, but like nationally, will that step or that shaming backfire? So that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. Sarah or Sharon, anything to add to that question? Okay.
So I will just say one
do,
thing.
yeah.
I don't know if it's helpful, but around one thing that we have, one thing that was studied was things like how different companies are. This is in the private domain, right? So without bringing in regulation, but are shamed differently in different contexts. So, for example, there's this fast food chain, Chick-fil-A, that had given, had made charitable contributions, I believe, to organizations that were working on anti-LGBTQ issues. And that may have increased their consumers in more conservative states. But then when they went into the Northeast, which they did recently, they really went out of their way to say, we are not a political, we're just a restaurant. We're just a chicken sandwich establishment. We don't actually stand for any values. And so it's another way of getting at this idea that like the context specificness of the shaming mechanisms is really a fascinating thing to look at.
I may
Thank you, Sarah.
add,
Yeah, please, sure.
if we look at if we look at shaming that works in the opposite direction, or something that is contrary to shaming, we might also want to consider faming. So in my book, I also look at faming instances and faming mechanisms that regulators use to also to encourage firms to become more climate responsible and let people know that they are doing something that is above compliance, and that consumers should buy their products and use their services and influence shareholders and investors, etc. But also to indirectly shame those companies that are not in the faming list or faming publications. So just another way of thinking about shaming working in maybe opposite ways.
So
Yeah, so
Sharon, a
since
follow-up question for you, if I may. So do you think shaming and faming are equally effective, or is the response of the actor, the targeted actor, symmetrical?
I think that's your area of expertise, but I think that some of the initial research in the field suggests that the combination of shaming and faming, it's not necessarily research in the context of climate change, but the combination of shaming and faming might be more effective than either separately. But usually the convention is that companies fear shaming more than they like faming, more than they want to be famed by regulator. By a regulator, they fear of shaming, they fear of their reputational costs. And in fact, research shows that they fear reputational costs more than the costs in reality. So there is maybe an over deterrence effect that regulators could use in their favor.
Assem, I'm curious your answer to that question as someone who studied, firms as voluntary environmentalists. How do you think faming would work?
I think at the heart of it is the information deficit model. That the assumption is that there are stakeholders who'd like to differentiate the leaders from the laggards, and they can't do it because they don't have the information. And if there's a credible source that can provide information in the right format that allows the stakeholders to compare across firms or any regulated actor for that matter, they will have the incentives to act appropriately. So the issue is, are stakeholders more willing to bestow rewards or to mete out punishment? And I think ESG becomes a very important issue here because the research is so split and so inconclusive. Whether ESG or announcing net zero emission goals, does it help firms? Does it hurt firms? My sense is that it all depends on the costs the stakeholders are willing to incur, because even when you shame, you incur a cost. And even if you are rewarding faming, you are incurring a cost, especially if you think from a stock market perspective. So I really don't know, because it is so context specific. One thing is for sure, that consumer boycotts are more effective than consumer boycotts. Boycotts means you affirmatively buy products that have, a good label, as opposed to boycotting. Because it's easier to boycott than to boycott, because boycott is more expensive. In boycott, you're simply substituting one product for another. So you're really not hurting yourself. So thinking from a stakeholder perspective and the collective action dilemmas they face and their willingness or unwillingness to incur costs, I would think shaming is more effective than faming because it is a lower cost option for stakeholders.
Thank you. Khan, you asked a question in the chat. I don't know if I think you're still on the call. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? If not, I can, yep, go ahead. Yep, maybe I'll ask it for you. I'm not sure you're still on. So Khan asked in the chat, who will provide or collect the information, and are there specific metrics for such information on which climate shaming to be framed? So I think it's kind of a question about some of the mechanics, maybe for you, Sharon, on how climate shaming might work in terms of who is collecting the information. You talked a little bit about having procedures in place to be sure that the information is credible. But what might these metrics look like? What kind of procedures might we have in practice to be sure that the information that is being collected and then characterized is done appropriately?
Thank you for the question. We have various mechanisms for climate shaming, and sometimes it really varies. Sometimes the information is collected by the regulators. Sometimes it comes from the firms themselves who are obliged to divulge the information. Sometimes the information is originated by the public. These could be public complaints or information gathered by NGOs. And also the level of confirming and the confirmation of the information may vary. There is an issue that we discussed earlier of the credibility of the information. There is not there isn't a standard that we can point to for these types of shaming. There is no framework law that I know of to formulate the climate shaming procedures. But there are specific arrangements in specific cases. For example, in the case of emissions databases, there are usually very, very highly detailed regulations that specify which factories should report and for which type of emissions, and the ways that the regulators will publicize the information to the public. So it very much varies and warrants further thought on maybe formalizing the process and considering a format that people can trust. Again, I'm going back to the issue of trust, of public trust.
Thank you for that. Sarah, I'm going to
thank you
direct
very
the question
much.
to you. That's all right. And I'm curious if you have examples or analogs from the human rights context where these types of shaming activities driven by government in particular have been effective, or maybe if there have been pitfalls in either shaming other countries for human rights abuses, perhaps, or corporations for working in places where human rights violations are common. Is there something that can be learned from that context, from your work or work that you're familiar with, that might be helpful in thinking about some of those scoping conditions that Assem was referencing about where climate shaming might be effective?
So I was thinking about this earlier, and I'm going to slightly answer the question that I wish you had asked me, but also answer the question that you asked, I hope. And it's sort of building on what Sharon just said. I think, that we have in California, for example, there's the California Supply Chains Act, which is really a disclosure regulation, which says companies doing business in California have to say, what they have in terms of corporate policies that address human rights and what they're doing to implement those policies. Ostensibly, that legislation was supposed to help consumers make better decisions about what companies to buy from and not buy from. But as somebody, you look at the company's California Supply Chains Act disclosures, which you'll always see on their websites, they're really difficult to make any kind of comparison across. It's really difficult to sort of know, like, of course, if the company is just disclosing it on their website, they're going to make themselves look really good. So not to have just the disclosure requirement without some kind of, here's what we're looking for, and some way for consumers to compare is really difficult it's the effectiveness proposition of those types of legislations is tricky. And would you count that as regulatory shaming? No, right? It's just a disclosure regulation without it doesn't like have a shaming element, and it doesn't really equip consumers with the information that they need to get on the shaming boat. So that's one example that I was thinking about. And the other one is, I've recently been looking at this. Customs and Border Protection, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, puts out press releases or announcements when it determines that goods that are being imported, like the goods will be held at the border because they have been determined to have been made in whole or in part with forced labor. When you look at those announcements, they're like very clinical. They're just like, company X's goods will be detained for a reason of suspicions of violations of, the US Tariff Act or whatever. There's like no condemnation. I mean, you can argue that the words forced labor on their own, like, sound a big alarm, a shaming alarm, but even for things like forced labor, the regulators themselves are like very sort of clinical in their announcements.
Yeah, thanks for that. You answered my question.
Okay, I'm glad.
Assem, did I cut you off earlier?
No, you did not. So
Okay.
this is actually a question for both Sharon and Sarah, and kind of building on what David said. So when we talk about regulatory shaming, we are talking in the context of a firm. But are supply chains within the ambit of the shaming framework? In this sense, can or is shaming as effective when you're shamed for the actions of your supply chain? So, for example, in the case of climate, it could be scope 3 emissions. And Sarah's own work on labor and human rights could be in terms of what's happening in your subcontractors abroad. Or target specificity is very important as a scope condition for shaming to work.
It's a great question to think about and to consider. I think that intuitively, I would say that in order for shaming to be effective, the information needs to be closely connected to the firm. And as it drifts away from the firm's control, it has lesser chance to work. However, we do know that the public response to information of various kinds, true or false, directly related to firms or indirectly related to firms. And so it may be unfair to shame firms for things that are close to being out of their control. If it's something that firms can influence through contracts with suppliers, through various other instruments, and they're the most effective actor that can influence the supply chain, then it might be fair to hold them accountable through the shaming mechanism. But it's a really interesting point. Yeah.
For me, I mean, in the human rights space, looking at the whole supply chain is really critically important, because oftentimes you won't see problems in the, home country of the corporation, although you do on occasion see child labor problems, meat packing, for example, here where some of you are in the US, not all of us. But yeah, for me, the name of the game is to get visibility into the entire supply chain. And the name of the game of like effective regulation is not to let companies off the hook just by saying, well, we don't control those actors that are at the bottom of our supply chain. You can't hold us responsible for these things that we don't even know what's going on. And this is something where I feel like Europe is really, forging an important path with mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, which is requiring companies of a certain size to carry out due diligence across their supply chains to prevent bad things from happening, and if they do happen, to take steps to remedy those harms. And if we only keep the shaming and the regulation lens focused on the big lead firm and we don't look beyond, we're missing where a lot of harms happen, certainly in human rights, but I believe as well environmentally.
Thank you, Sarah. Indra, do you want to ask your question and maybe direct it to somebody in particular if it is directed to somebody?
Was that for me?
Yes, it was. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I was wondering about shaming whole countries rather than companies. I could see some countries being quite sensitive, countries that maybe have an image of themselves as being pro-climate, and they might be very sensitive to being shamed. So maybe that would be more effective than shaming companies. Just wondering, I'm not directed at anybody in particular, just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So even broader than firms, what might be the role for regulatory shaming of of counterpart countries. I don't know if anybody wants to take that one on.
I can go first.
Thanks, Assem.
Yeah, so there is actually some work on this, and it was predominantly on the ease of doing business, the metric that World Bank had developed, and countries were very sensitive about it because there was a perception that foreign direct investors are looking at ease of doing business very carefully. In fact, the scandal was that the World Bank had kind of manipulated the ranking of certain countries to make certain countries look good. And that's why I think 2022, they withdrew this ease of doing business because it came under so much of criticism. So country level naming and shaming seems to be working under some conditions for certain issue areas. I'm less sure that it is actually working for climate. And the reason is that in some ways, climate issues are so broad. And if you are a foreign direct investor and you're seeking to invest in a particular country, unless until it's really about climate adaptation, climate vulnerability, and whether you're going to be caught, your investment is going to get stranded and you'll not be able to extricate yourself because the circumstances have changed. I don't think companies are that worried because from the perspective of foreign direct investor, it is the ease of both entry and exit so that, your assets and your profits are not expropriated by the local country, by the host country. So unfortunately, I don't think country level shaming or naming is going to be very effective for climate mitigation. It might be effective for climate adaptation. In fact, in one co and I published an article where we showed that municipal level bonds at the city level actually are reflective, or their ranking by credit rating firms reflects their adaptation profile as opposed to mitigation profile. Because cities, if they are adapting well to climate change, there's a higher chance they'll be able to repay the debt and able to service the debt as opposed to mitigation, which creates a global public good. So I think climate discussions will need to get more nuanced. And I am putting my bet on adaptation in terms of delivering signals to the appropriate stakeholders, especially the financial markets, about the ability of the countries to be resilient to various kind of climate risks.
Thank you, Assem. Sharon, Sarah, anything to add there?
I mean, I had a thought when you raised the question, Indra, that it feels to me like there is quite a lot of shaming going on in the context of, global climate agreements where developing countries are pointing to developed countries and saying, it's around the question of who's going to pay for mitigation and adaptation efforts, and developing countries saying you developed countries were able to develop using all these natural resources, and we if we're not going to do that with our own resources, you have to pay us for that. It's not corporate regulation, but I think there is certainly country shaming afoot in that way. And as far as like human rights, there is certainly, there are countries that you cannot source from without running into these trade sanctions and having your goods detained at the border. So in the US, anything, believed to have come from North Korea won't be allowed in because it's presumptively assumed to have been made with forced labor. Likewise, any goods that are made in whole or in part touching the Xinjiang Uyghur region of China will be treated that way. And these withhold release orders are having massive impacts on how companies do business and how they design their supply chains. So it's a piece of the country shaming question.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of our time, but I want to, Sharon, give you the floor one last time. If there's anything more you want to add about climate shaming, or you can just tell us where to find your book, that would be great as well. But I want to give you maybe a minute or two for any concluding thoughts.
Well, thank you, David. First of all, I want to thank everyone for participating today, the panelists and the audience, of course, and allowing me to think more about regulatory shaming and especially regulatory climate shaming. Writing the book was an insightful experience for me. And I learned a lot, and I hope that I contributed some to the development of the field of climate law, regulation, and governance, as well as regulatory shaming, which is an interest of mine in various other fields as well, the general theory of regulatory shaming. So what I felt the book was about eventually is saying that climate change is an appropriate cause for regulatory shaming. It's a suitable field for not only for shaming companies in the energy sector, but also for shaming banks and investors and companies that are indirectly contributing to global warming. And we talked about supply chain, and we talked about many other actors that contribute to climate change. So I think we need to move on from focusing only on consumers and investors to also think about employees and NGOs, as we discussed today, and the media and researchers, and really open up the discussion to nudging other actors to take part in the shaming mechanism, as well as to target other firms, not only firms in the fossil fuel industry. So I hope this was interesting enough to read more from the book, and you can find it on the Cambridge Core website. As we said, it's part of the Cambridge. It's part of a Cambridge Element series, and there's a link in the chat. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Sarah, Nassim, and Joana Setzer for a wonderful discussion. It's a very, I think, insightful discussion of this topic. And Sharon, thank you in particular for your contributions and for getting us all together to take on this topic of climate shaming. Also, thanks to all of you in the audience for contributing, if your great questions, and of course to APPAM for hosting us today. So with that, this will bring our webinar to a close. I wish everybody a good day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, David.
Thank you so much. Bye.